Hi, my name is David Gawley from Pentagon Solutions. I'm here to talk about Building Information Modelling, or BIM, for SMEs. So, what is BIM? I love this saying where if you put 10 people in the room and ask them what BIM is, you'll get 11 answers. And there's a certain truth to that, particularly if you go and Google BIM and look at the different terms. So, what do we mean when we actually talk about BIM? Well, essentially it's a process for building something digitally before we build it for real. But we do this on very clear employer's requirements, or appointing party as we now know them. And this is done in a collaborative manner, where the contractor's design team assess their supply chain and deliver something digitally. Digital can mean a lot of different things, as we'll see later on. But essentially it's about collaborative approach to construction and design projects. One key thing in here that doesn't just apply to buildings, it applies to infrastructure, can apply to rail, can apply to water projects. It's not just for large projects as well, and it's not just about 3D models, as we'll see in a minute. It's not complete or perfect. There's still work and there's still alignment that needs to be done, and we'll see this with the ISO 19650 standards and series. So typically what we tend to think about BIM is this. We've got a rich model, and yes, there's a certain element of truth in here. We've got different information containers that build up a federated model. We've got a rich architectural, structural, mechanical and electrical model in here. This is part of the design process and we'll have various outputs. But BIM is much more than this. We've got to think about how we collaborate this information, how we share it with other users, how this information actually goes through transition or stages and gets checked. And the client ultimately needs to look at it, to look at the project information requirements and see, do they have the correct information? As we can see in here, we have rich asset information which the client will want to own throughout the life cycle of the building or infrastructure once it's constructed. And the same applies for infrastructure projects. Again, this is another example. This is open data from Newry Town Hall. This is some BIM for subsurface information in here. And whilst it's very important to have the actual model elements or the information containers as part of that, we need to make key decisions about the project as we're actually going along. It does still have the rich data behind it, but there are processes where we need to feed this information through as part of the design, construction and operation phases. So what we like to say BIM is about is it starts off with very clear information exchange requirements, which is set by the appointing party or the actual client. Industry responds to that. They respond from BIM execution plan, that's by the appointed party. And they look at mobilization and how they're going to actually assess their supply chain. So we feed in information containers and different bits of data. But we do this in a collaborative manner. So we do it to a structured process where all the information is consistent and the same. We look at different types of software that will actually drive the project deliverables. We then use standards and frameworks, and particularly new framework standards actually come in, which is ISO 19650. We look at functions as well as part of this, or roles in old money, and we assign these particular functions throughout the project. And if we do this, we look at the standards, methods and procedures of delivery. So we need to check the information. We need to check this against the project information requirements. And if we do this, we need to make sure that everything's coordinated, everything's spatially correct. We're not fudging information from the architectural drawing, going to the civil engineering drawing, from millimeters to meters, etc. So we know that everything's spatially coordinated. And if we do this, we'll get a quality deliverable. We can look at the costs, we can look at time, we can look at efficiency, and we can look at risk as well. So why BIM? What's the compelling need? Well, we need to begin with the end in mind as part of this process. And if you think about all the reports that have come from industry from a number of years ago, such as Latham and Egan, we talk about construction industry modernisation. We talk about construction industry and productivity levels not improving. So there's three areas I'm going to focus on here: is technology change. And if you think about where we've come from a technology perspective, we traditionally started out in drawing boards. We looked at layer production of information. We then moved to computers and computer-aided design. We then moved to 3D objects, and this in turn moved to intelligent objects. So we could actually start to analyse and get data, useful data from the model from a design perspective and a constructability perspective. But technology is also moving on. We look at VR, we look at AR, we look at mixed reality as part of that. We've got drone data as well. So there's an enormous amount of technology and opportunity in the construction industry which can actually be used as part of that process. But it's not all about technology. People change as well, roles change as part of that. So if we think about the traditional roles, they'll still be in place, but we'll have new roles and functions such as information management. We need someone to keep checks and tabs on what we're actually delivering digitally. And our processes change. So traditionally when we look at handover information, where we move from paper, we look at health and safety, O&M manuals getting submitted, we need to make sure that this information is put in digitally. And we're not just talking about from a USB perspective or submitting it online. We need to make sure it's a connected workflow and a single source of truth for the project owner. So there's a real opportunity for change in there. From the client perspective, this graph will give an interesting insight on this. So if we think about how project information is delivered and how the model actually progresses. In the early design stages, we've got very little attribute design data. We might have a lot of conceptual model information in there, and that will be driven by the design team. As we move to build and the contractor takes this information on, there's less graphic design or less changes in there because most of the calculations have actually been performed and most of the detailed work is actually being fleshed out. So the contractor will be really looking at the asset information that needs to be delivered. From the client perspective, in many cases, they probably won't change the building or infrastructure. And if they do, it will be at a very low level. So they're predominantly attribute driven. And that's important that we have the right information and the right deliverables at different stages throughout the project. As we can see, the construction can live for a period of time, but will ultimately an owner operation, this could go for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. There are benefits in BIM, and we've seen many cases and many different samples throughout the UK and Ireland. And this is from reduced rework, better quality deliverables. We can actually look at cost and function in here as well. So there are numerous benefits as part of this process that can actually be adopted and picked up by SMEs. But there is pressure for industry to reform. And if we look at recent reports such as the Farmer Review, which has been very critical of the construction industry and using terms such as modernise or die. But we'll also look in other aspects of the UK, particularly in England and Wales, where the construction industry has the highest insolvency rates. And there's an opportunity to modernise to try and reduce the risk of those very tight construction margins that we actually have. So why BIM from SME? What's the opportunity? Well, SMEs are the backbone of the construction industry. They account for at least 90% of all new businesses throughout the UK. And the startup rates in Northern Ireland, as an example, studied by Queen's, 27 people out of every 10,000 actually start their own SME. So there's a real good opportunity in here to actually adopt BIM processes. So what are the benefits? How can a digital approach actually benefit your business? What do we need to do? Well, there's an opportunity for improved project delivery. We can help reduce project costs. Ultimately, we can look at compliance and regulation as well, particularly health and safety, any risk reduction. And risk reduction is a big part of the new ISO 19650. We can digital delivery on alignment. And there's an opportunity to look at improved decision making. And in many cases, we've actually seen this attracts more business for SMEs. So what's Northern Ireland policy in relation to BIM? Well, the Department of Finance has released its procurement guidance notice on this, and there was a concern that there was going to be a burden on contractors and supply chain in delivering BIM. So they complied with the EU threshold in this at 4.3 million. There's been a PGN that's been released that actually gives advice to companies on BIM, where you can read and actually look at the documentation behind that. But there are plans, we've recently talked to DOF to actually have an alignment to ISO. So the PGN still talks about BIM level 2, but over the coming year there will be a plan to have that aligned with the ISO 19650 series. As an example, the impact on SME, this is one of the extractions that's taken from the exchange information requirements from the DOF website. And we can see in here typical deliverables. So an SME may have to consider not only how they're actually federating information into the actual project, also how they assess their supply chain or be assessed as part of that process, but also look at the actual digital deliverables. And this is very important, and this is a consideration that needs to be made. So what's the impact? Well, one of the impacts in there is a supply chain assessment. And normally it would be the appointed party, which could be the design team or the contractor, to actually assess their supply chain or appointed parties if they become part of the project. So that's where they would actually look at capability and capacity to deliver BIM. And that was one of the concerns at DOF, is that there was going to be a concern of BIM delivery and is there capability within industry. The other aspect in there is the response to the exchange information requirements, where we need to look at a BIM execution plan. So a BIM execution plan, if we think about it, is how we're actually going to deliver the project based on the exchange information requirements from the appointed party or from the client. So it's very important that contractors need to be able to assess their supply chain, and that will also include professional services. So there's a response element in there and how that information is actually collated. The good news for this is there's numerous templates online that you can actually use for this, and many main contractors now have actually embedded this as part of the process and have this information online to be submitted. So what are the digital changes in industry? What's the shift that we're actually seeing? One thing that we have found is that roles are changing. If we think about what we used to pigeonhole roles, we used to have design, professional services, we maybe had a CAD technician, we had a civil engineering graduate, we had a principal engineer. What we're finding now is that we're getting into these data science roles. So we have the need to actually analyse data and look at analytics from construction projects or construction information at handover. That generates a challenge in its own right, because many graduates coming out will still want to become professionally qualified. And this is where we see professional body alignment. Many of the professional bodies have actually recognised that BIM is an important part of this process. And to give one example in here, CIBSE, the Chartered Institute of Building Services Engineers, actually have a Society for Digital Engineering. So they're saying that if anyone wants to become professionally qualified and registered through the Engineering Council, such as engineering technician, corporate engineer or chartered engineer, they can do it through CIBSE, but they also have an SDE, Society for Digital Engineering, because they realise that the need for their members are actually changing. So it's quite exciting that we see that a professional body alignment take place. Other challenges and changes in here is the National Digital Twin, or the NDT. So we talk about the physical asset being connected to the digital asset. So there's a great opportunity when it comes to the likes of artificial intelligence, big data, analytics, predictability in there of when assets are actually failing. So that's a very important part of that process and generates opportunity. If we think about infrastructure, and if we think about Belfast City Centre, Belfast City Council is actually trying to grow the number of people working in the city by 50,000 and grow the population by 70,000. And really that can only be done if we take a BIM or digital approach to this, because we need to assess the current infrastructure. We need to look at water, we need to look at resources, we need to look at all those factors that actually impact that. There's a good opportunity when it comes to BIM for infrastructure. We're seeing some reports and commissions come out, such as Project Iceberg, where we're looking at BIM for the subsurface. This is essentially where we need a higher level of detail or higher need of information under the subsurface. So there's a real opportunity there to look at this and not just deliver it from a geospatial point of view. There are also challenges in here. How do we integrate BIM with geospatial or GIS? GIS is part of the process, but we need to look at those interoperability opportunities. So what are the key challenges from an industry perspective? Well, from a delivery perspective, poor client exchange requirements is for one. So the clients need to look at the assets they maintain. They need to look at the information behind the assets and why we require this information in the first instance. They need to be very specific. There's no point in asking for information or data behind an asset if we don't know what the requirement is. So it's very important that an appointing party or the client will actually ask, what asset information are we looking at? What's the business driver for it? What's the need? Is it compliance? Is it regulation? Is it part of PPM? Or is it a common reactive issue? Other challenges are interface points. And if we think about model regression, so we might have a highly detailed manufactured component, as we can see here with the blower unit. But as we actually come more towards this, we maybe look at mechanical services, we can see we need to reduce the level of information need in there. As we come towards the outside of the site, that will get reduced a bit further into the civil engineering contractor as well. And the client may have a need to actually deliver that information in the geospatial solution. So the real challenge is here is the interface points when they actually meet and how do we assemble that information together. There are organisation challenges, and this is predominantly on the client function. So if we think about all the different disciplines and teams that we have, and we've got different business units, we've got different heads of departments, and we've got different budgets. So we could have GIS, we could have O&M, IT, design, procurement, etc., HR, all through that. We tend to have this natural barrier between them because we've got different heads and we've got different budgets. So if we look at what the client's actually delivering, they're either delivering a product, they're delivering a service, and they also have their own staff and employees. So as part of the BIM or digital process, we need to make sure that those barriers are removed, because the exchange requirements will actually have that requirement because it will be overarching through all the disciplines. Some big technology challenges are in here. So if we look at the different technology in industry, so we have BIM authoring software, we've got GIS software, we've got FM software, we've got data management, and we have enterprise different systems in there as well. So one client's route may be very different from another client. So that'll put a stress on project demand. So no two projects from a delivery perspective will be the same. But ultimately the client needs to look at this information and see how that data will actually flow. So what's the key takeaway and next steps? Well, you need to ask, does BIM or a digital approach impact my business? You should look at downloading the UK BIM Alliance guidance documentation, and probably do that before you actually purchase the actual ISO 19650, because it is a good guide. Make sure you have alignment with the UK National Annex as well as part of that process. So do understand how that actually fits into projects you're actually delivering. I wouldn't rush into any technology as well, or any new hardware or training until you understand how BIM actually impacts your business. You should look to identify a pilot project, and when you're ready, you need to make sure that you can actually quantify the benefits, because that's part of the benefits for you as a business, to make sure that you see a more digital approach, how it can improve business needs. And as always, you need to learn lessons, adapt, and make sure you improve on any of these lessons from previous projects. Thank you very much for your time. If you would like some information on this, please go to the CITB NI website.